Well, hello again, everyone. We're back now with Genesis chapter 40 and have entitled this chapter Forget Me Not, hence the picture. Uh, so we'll go ahead and get started now tonight. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 7 says, Then I, Jesus, said, Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God. And in Luke 24:44, she said, Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And that's exactly what we're doing here. The reason I went back and after Daniel and Revelations, went back to Genesis, because I want to start going through the Old Testament and seeing where Jesus is all the way through the Old Testament. And we've seen that in every single chapter so far here in our study in Genesis. And we're going to see it more in this chapter tonight. So this entire Old Testament was written about Jesus. So let's look for glimpses of him as we read through this chapter. I'll try to point out the ones I see. If you guys see some that I've missed or that jumped out to you if you were reading ahead, let me know. I've been told there's over 100. I'm not surprised at that at all. So we have a picture here of Jesus, I think, to start. There is no record of sin in Joseph's life, and there was no record of sin in Daniel's life. Not that either of them were sinless men, of course, but they point to Jesus. And why? Well, there's lessons for all of us. But remember, the Jews only had and have the Old Testament. This is the way God, the Father, is presenting Jesus to the Jewish people in the Old Testament. So they can see glimpses of Jesus, the coming Messiah, as they read these stories. And Joseph is a perfect example of that. Now, so as we start, we see Joseph suffering, right, for something he didn't do with Potiphar's wife, just like Jesus suffered for things he never did. He paid the price for things we did. So as we get started in Genesis 40, verse 1, it says, It came to pass after these things that the butler, from here on out, I'm going to refer to him as the cupbearer. I'll explain why in a minute or two. And the baker of the king of Egypt, who we know as Pharaoh, they offended the Lord, the king of Egypt. So it came to pass, right? And to me, it just said, no matter what we're going through, it will come to pass. Everything comes to pass. So if things are going good, they're not going to go good forever. And if things are going bad, it's going to end soon. So we just need to recognize there's a time and a season for everything. And we'll go through them all. We're all going to get trials because all of us need our characters improved. It says offended. The word is kata in Hebrew. It means to miss the mark or to sin. It'd be the word harmatia in Greek, right? Sin, missing the mark, missing the bullseye on the mark. And a truth, just like us, we sin, we offend the Lord, but he provides a solution for us, as we're going to see here, redemption. This is a picture of redemption. Now we have a butler, and the butler was over the vineyards or the wine cellars. So he probably had hundreds of people working for him. And he's better called the cupbearer, like we see if we read in Nehemiah chapter 1. That's what that person was called, who oversaw the vineyards and the wine cellars. So a cupbearer was kind of like the Secret Service. His job was to assure no one messed with the wine. Now, a baker, he oversaw everything having to do with the meal. He'd be like the head chef. So it says in verse 2, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the cupbearer and the chief baker. Angry is kasaf. That means furious or to burst out in a rage, to be enraged. And chef is a word sar. Both of these guys are cabinet officials. And so he put them in custody in or below or beneath the house of the captain of the guard. in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. We just talked about that in chapter 39. So the prison in Hebrew is mishmar, under the house, like the arrest where Joseph was placed. This was like the place where prisoners on death row were kept. Potiphar was the chief executioner for Pharaoh. And those people on death row were in the prison below his house where he could oversee them. That's why I believe he is responsible for Joseph being overcharged of these prisoners now. And the question I had, how long was Joseph in this prison? I don't think anyone knows for sure. One commentator did some of the math and came to a conclusion that Joseph was probably here for 7 or 8 years. That's possible. We do know from the next chapter that he was 30 years old when he went to work for Pharaoh. And that's interesting because that's the same age as Jesus started his ministry. And Jesus is the son of the God the Father. Joseph is going to become the vice president, if you will, under the Pharaoh. So another comparison of the two. And a question here, what happened here? Well, what did they do to upset the Pharaoh? We're not told. Maybe they burnt the toast or overcooked the hamburger or served Welch's grape juice instead of fine wine. We don't know exactly what took place here. More than likely that the wine taster or the food taster just dropped dead, like an attempted assassination plot against the Pharaoh. We just saw this happen here in the United States a couple of weeks ago, right? Nothing new under the sun. This happened a lot in this nation. And the Pharaoh threw both of these guys in jail until he could determine which one was guilty. That's simply my suspicion here. This is what's going on. One or the other of them, whatever they served, took out the taster, and he threw them both in jail until he could figure it out. Now, Potiphar, Genesis 37:36, and we went back a few chapters, it says captain of the guard. That's what he is. He's a chief executioner, a ministry of slaughter in the Hebrew. A butcher is another word for it. If so, it means he must have believed that Joseph was innocent of his wife's charges, because he's treating Joseph differently from the others that are in the prison below his house. His job is to put them to death when it's their time. And maybe he said to Joseph, look, I'm sorry you're in here. I know you didn't do anything wrong. I had no choice. Imagine if you had to live with her. Again, just my opinion, but I can kind of see how this is developing here. He has full faith and trust in Joseph. And notice Potiphar has Joseph serve these two who were likely also in a high-ranking cabinet type position. These would have been Potiphar's friends, but he knows these guys. He's one of these cabinet members, if you will. So he has Joseph serve them. It means he waited upon them, he ministered to them, he helped them out. As an observation here, no matter what Joseph was given to do, whether he was as a slave or as a prisoner now in prison, he was determined to do the best he could at it. And we should do the same. No matter what we do, we should do it the best we possibly can. Be the best at whatever the Lord calls us to do for him. Now, as a foreshadow, as I mentioned before, I think maybe in the last lesson, things that point towards the future, not necessarily comparisons to Jesus, not necessarily a prophetic verse or passage, but just foreshadowing something. This seems to point forward to another man who would be taken captive in another country, have his own and interpret other people's dreams, and end up being the second person in command in the country. Anybody remember those studies? Daniel in Babylon. So Joseph is a foreshadow of Daniel to come. Almost identical situations. Nothing is bad is said of either of these two. And they both end up dying in a foreign country. So the similarities are amazing. Joseph is carried away in a caravan to a foreign country. Daniel is carried away by the Babylonians from Jerusalem in the captivity. So there's so many comparisons between the two of those two. In Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And it sounds to me like Potiphar has seen the light. I don't know for sure. I would not be shocked if we see him in heaven, because I think Joseph had a tremendous impact on him. Now, verse 5, then the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had dreams, both of them. And each man's dream in the same night, and each man's dream had its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning, so it sounds like he's not actually in the prison with them, and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So here we're told both had dreams, two dreams. Remember, Joseph had two dreams that he told his brothers and then his brother and his dad. Pharaoh's going to have two dreams soon. Nebuchadnezzar had two dreams. I mean, this is a repeat. We'll see why here shortly. But two dreams, I think, is the equivalent of having two witnesses. You know that God says his word is confirmed by two or three witnesses. You're not to put anybody to death without two or three witnesses. So that keeps cropping up. An interpretation here in Egypt, they had a small g god named Thoth, Thoth, who was the god of dreams. And so in prison, they couldn't go to this pagan image of Thoth and try to get an interpretation from whoever the priestess was there in the temple. And it says this is occurring in the morning. Well, what happens in the morning? The light, right? Light comes out. Light is what? Revelation. Jesus is what? The morning star. It's amazing how much of this stuff happens in the daylight. Evil in the darkness, revelation comes in the day, in the light. So it says that Joseph looked and he saw. It's not that like he glanced over at them, but he looked with purpose and he perceived. How often I look past and keep going. You just have to acknowledge it. I'd be driving along. I'm watching the road ahead of me. I'm thinking about where it is I'm going or what I'm going to be doing when I get there. And Kathy'd say, hey, maybe we should stop and pull over and help that person. And I never even saw the person on the side of the road. I overlooked them. She didn't. So I'm guilty of that. Joseph looked and he saw. He paid attention to the people around him. Probably a really good spiritual truth for all of us. It says they were sad. It was off, to be grieved, troubled, or stressed. In Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1b, behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And in Romans 12:15b, weep with them that weep. We're expected to observe, to be observant when people are having a hard time, to at least try to step in and comfort them, to encourage them, to maybe stop and lay a hand on them, pray for them. Ask if you can pray for them. But both on a personal level and in watching others, I've noticed that we usually turn inward, the majority of the people. I'm not too concerned about your problems because I have enough problems of my own. Or maybe I'm the only one that's like that. I have a hunch some of you listening are probably in the same boat that I am. But after studying this chapter, I'm convinced that some of my problems are intended to get me to be a comforter to somebody else that's in trouble. When I'm struggling with something, I'm more apt to recognize it in somebody else. And maybe that's how God gets our attention. And we need to understand here, God isn't punishing Joseph. This would sound horrible. He's sold into slavery, and then he's accused of rape. Now he's in a prison with a bunch of death row prisoners. Right? He's not being punished. God's preparing him to be the man he plans for him to be. Joseph is going through a spiritual training camp, if you will, in baseball, or two-a-days in football, or maybe the gym to buff up and get in shape. We got something over the picture, Lisa. And I'm reminded of the story of a man who was complaining because he had no shoes. And then the Lord had him walk by a man who was on a little roller platform because his both legs had been amputated. I mean, it's so easy to be, just overwhelmed with our own problems that we miss things other people are going through. So no matter what I face, someone else is facing something much more difficult. And instead of ignoring them, I think the Lord wants me and you to see if there's something we can do for them. That's how God gets people promoted. And if we think we have it bad, maybe we should go visit a nursing home, get a whole new perspective on suffering. Drive into one of the main cities in California or in Texas or New York or Pennsylvania. Look at all the homeless. I mean, it's horrible what people are having to go through. Like people living in these other countries, particularly in African nations. I mean, they can't get even food and water. We think we have things tough. Now, in verse 7, it says, so he asked Pharaoh's officers, these two guys, who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? And they were looking sadly raw or distressed or heavy-hearted. I wrote pout-faced or perplexed, but they're facing a death sentence, okay? I mean, it doesn't get a lot worse than that. In Psalm 42:5, this came to my mind. Why so downcast, oh my soul? Well, these guys had a reason. Things were not going well for them. And it's kind of funny, I thought, why would you ask somebody on death row why they're sad, right? Obviously, Joseph wasn't sad because they've never asked him why he's sad. He's other-focused instead of self-focused. In Philippians 2:4, we see, let each of you, meaning us, look out not only for our own interests, but also for the interest of others. And I found in ministry, when I prayed for other people's needs, my needs ended up getting met. It's funny how God does that. I also saw that I could ask somebody how they were doing, kind of hoping they'd say fine and walk away, which most people do. And they'll say fine or great, but they really don't mean it. They're putting on a happy face. The truth is, I really kind of hope that that's what they'd say because I didn't want to deal with someone else's problems. That's being self-focused. God wants us to be other-focused. Now, a question, is it possible that God has a blessing for us that will only come to fruition if we first bless somebody else? Think about that. God has a blessing waiting for you, intending for you to do something he's put on your heart to do. And the minute you do it, he's going to end up passing that blessing on to you. Maybe somebody listening to this needs to hear this. I know I need to hear it. Be other-focused, right? Think of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit more often than I do of me, myself, and I. And that's an easy trap to fall into. And as an observation here, I don't read anywhere that somebody asked Joseph why he looked so sad. He's in a tough spot. He's gone through a lot of years, not of his own doing. Maybe he didn't show a lot of common sense, maybe is the word. I don't know. He was naive, sharing the dreams with his brothers and his dad. But that would be at the worst. I don't see it as a sin. He hasn't done anything to get him into all these predicaments. And yet, if anybody could have been sad and depressed, it'd be him. And yet he busies himself trying to serve and help others. So like Daniel and Joseph, they both spend time with God, and their focus has changed off of themselves onto others. We're always to be our brother's keeper. Remember, we read that back in Genesis chapter 4, I think, when God asked Cain where his brother Abel was? And he asks, am I my brother's keeper? Well, yeah. And it's the same for you and I today. So another Joseph like Jesus, didn't Jesus do the same? Wasn't he innocent of all charges, yet given a death sentence for what other people did? Maybe just another picture here for us. Verse 8, and they said to him, we each have had a dream, but there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, well, do not interpretations belong to God, big G God? So tell them to me, please. So it sounds a lot like Daniel. In the midst of his own suffering, he's still looking to minister to others. In Proverbs 15:13, it says, a merry heart makes a cheerful countenance. I suspect this is a description of Joseph. Walked around with a smile on his face. And it mentions dreams. And we've seen so many dreams in this study in Genesis with Abimelech, with Jacob, with Laban, with the Midianite, with Joseph, now these two men. And it's going to continue as we go through this. And I learned while studying that dreams appeared to pagans twice as much as believers, which is interesting. God tries to reach the lost through dreams many times. It's happening today in Iran, in China, and other places. And revivals breaking out in those nations. Some people are even reporting Jesus appearing to them, not reappear, appearing to them in their bedroom, on their bed, sleeping, waking them up and actually appearing to them. I'd love for that to happen here. Some dreams are the result of last night's dinner, right? We need to go to the Bible. If you think God's speaking to you in a dream, ask him. Ask him to show you, to confirm it. 2 witnesses, 2 or 3 witnesses, right? He'll lead you to the perfect passage if the dream is from him. He'll always confirm it. So these two know that the dreams they have a meaning of some significance, but they just don't understand it. And Joseph says, look, we need to turn to God, not to your Egyptian god Thoth, for the interpretation or the solution to this. So he plants them or points them to the God, which is always a good idea for us. Verse 9 says, then the cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. So he volunteers, and he says to him, behold, in my dream, a vine, typically a picture of sanctification, was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, it blossomed, shot forth, and in its clusters brought forth grapes, ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So notice here, in both these dreams, the Lord uses pictures that would have made sense to the cupbearer and in the baker. And I think if he gives you a dream, it's going to relate to something you're familiar with. You may not understand the meaning of it, but you're going to understand the pictures he gives you. And also notice how many groups of 3s are mentioned. And so here, Joseph says to him, verse 12, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler or cupbearer. So there's lots of 3s here, right? He's going to lift, he's going to restore, and he's going to return. So this is great news for the cupbearer. You're going to return to the right hand of power, right? More typology of Jesus and us after salvation. It says, lift up your head. That's going to be a good thing, right? Pharaoh's going to recognize you. You'll be restored and find favor. In Psalm 3:3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. And then according to, or mishpat in Hebrew, means judgment. So in other words, after you've been judged, Pharaoh is judging you. And after he's judged you, this is what's going to happen. And so this is a picture of God's judgment. And then he mentions the cup. Pharaoh's going to trust you, and he's going to drink the cup again. So if Pharaoh's going to drink the cup again out of this guy's hand, I go back to the beginning of this chapter, either the wine or the food probably took out the taster. So a suggestion maybe for study, if you guys are just into studying different things, if you're interested, use the Blue Letter Bible or something like it and look up all the references to 3 days. It happened with Abraham. It happened with Isaac. It happens with Jonah and the fish. Jesus is in the tomb for 3 days. Makes me wonder if Joseph wasn't in the cistern for 3 days before the caravan came. Again, that's just a question I have. I don't know if that was the case or not. In verse 14, but remember me when, right? So not if. So Joseph is certain of his interpretation. Not only here's the interpretation, I'm so confident you're getting out of here. You're going to be let go. That will you remember me when you get out of here? Show me kindness, please. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house or prison. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. Who are the Hebrews? Israel. Where is Israel? The promised land. And also, I have done nothing here that should have put me in this dungeon. So I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything with Pharaoh's wife or Potiphar's wife. And I thought of a song. I'll be aging myself again. The Animals singing, "We got to get out of this place no matter what we do." I mean, that verse came to me. Those words came to me from the song. So he makes this request, right? Remember or think about me when it's going well for you. When you get to go home, return to your family, return to your job, everything's going fine. Will you please show me kindness? Make mention of me. Get me out of this place. I haven't done anything wrong. You're my get out of jail free card, if you will. I also want to be restored. So these two have been with Joseph for roughly 2 years. And yet Joseph needs to explain why he's in the dungeon right here. He's explaining it to them. And this indicates that he'd never even shared this with them before. He wasn't having a pity party this whole time. He's living in the now, not in the past. And it reminded me of Philippians in chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. Paul writing from prison, one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, reaching forward to those things which are ahead, press forward towards the goal for the prize of the upward calling of God in Christ Jesus. Forget the past, right? So another secret to success, don't continue living in the past. Jesus paid for your past. Reach forward, press towards the mark, move ahead where the prize is. It's waiting for you. So don't keep driving through life looking in the rearview mirror, as somebody once said. And a spiritual truth, you have anyone like that around you. It's always the same old story, always the same complaint. Every time you see them, they rehearse the same thing to you over and over again, right? Playing the same old sorry record over and over again. Or maybe you're that person. Maybe I'm that person. I've been that person in the past. And living in the past hurts, and you never move ahead. You're just stuck there. The Lord wants us to move on. He paid for the past, stop living it. His mercies are new every morning. We see in Lamentations 3, verse 22 to 24. Though the Lord's mercies are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. So we can look forward. We have a new mercy every single morning when we wake up. It's a brand new day. Yesterday's already gone, over and done with. Can't change it. Just let's move on. Living in the past is a choice. It's a self-imposed sentence we put on ourselves. It's not a sentence from God. He never asked us to go back and relive tomorrow. So Joseph here is just hoping one good deed deserves another. Now, as a foreshadow, he's saying, remember me. And I didn't see this. I probably read this chapter 6 or 7 times before I saw this. he says, remember me to who? The cupbearer. The cupbearer is going to be before Pharaoh. He's going to bring the wine and he's going to observe somebody serve the bread, right? Before Pharaoh. Didn't Jesus tell us to do the same thing with communion? When he served the wine and broke the bread and said, do this in remembrance of him? Just another foreshadow of something coming in the future, communion. And a spiritual truth, wasn't Jesus restored to his rightful place after 3 days? Just like this cupbearer. So a kindness, he says, it's kashed, means grace in Hebrew. Joseph is asking for grace. And if we keep this picture going with these comparisons, Joseph is a middleman of grace to the cupbearer, right? So now he places Pharaoh as God and asks the cupbearer to be the middleman for him. Just a replication of the same picture. Jesus stands in the middle for us. Joseph is standing in the middle between the cupbearer and Potiphar, who is a king of that nation. And then it says stolen away, and this was interesting. Joseph first hides his brother's faults, and he speaks not of his being sold, but stolen. Remember, they sold him to the caravan. And in Hebrew, it says ganab. It means stolen twice, or deceived twice, if you will. He was deceived by his brothers, and now he's being deceived by the wife. So he was stolen, or deceived, just for emphasis. And as an observation, who is it that has stolen Joseph away from his calling? Well, it'd be interesting. I suggest it's Satan. And he's working through the brothers in the first case. Now he's working through this wife. His intent is to disrupt and end the line of the coming Messiah, Jesus. So why Joseph? I think Satan saw Joseph as God's chosen one. That's who I would have thought God would have picked to be in the line of Jesus. So if nothing else, God has just given Satan a head fake here, as we're going to see in a later chapter, because it's going to be Judah that ends up with the birthright, the fourth son, not Joseph. But Satan seems to be throwing everything he has at Joseph to get him out of the picture. And the dungeon, again, that's that same word here in Hebrew that we saw as the word for cistern that Joseph was thrown into. So in the Hebrew, there's so many plays on words and so many double meanings and triple meanings of words that you just have to wonder if Joseph might not have been in there for 3 days. Now, verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation or the solution was good for the cupbearer, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for the Pharaoh, and the birds came and ate them out of the basket on my head. So here we go again with the threes, another group of 3. There's baskets, baked goods, and birds. So as an observation here, notice the cupbearer jumped at the chance to get an understanding of his dream from Joseph, from God. The baker he didn't jump up with his request. I don't think he was going to share his dream, and he only shared the dream after the first guy got a good report. Again, just an opinion. And I think that, number one, was it because the cupbearer was an innocent man and didn't have anything to hide? And perhaps the baker is the guilty one and he's afraid of being found out? And now maybe he's going to get a good interpretation. Again, just an opinion. In ministry, I found many people would get opinions from a dozen people, but they wouldn't want to pray and ask God. And I think it's because they knew what the answer was going to be. And we're always looking for an alternative. If we don't like what we think we're going to hear, we just keep looking for alternatives till we hear one we like. and then we'll run with that one. We're kind of afraid to take something to the Lord, if something's wrong. Just again, my observation from lots of counseling sessions with people in church. And again, here we see, and this is interesting, white wicker baskets, baked goods, and birds. And I don't think I wrote this down below here, but in those days, that the chief baker would carry the 3 baskets on top of their head. And so it was possible that the birds would fly down when they'd see the basket of the breads on the top basket and peck away at the bread. So that's kind of the picture here. The baker would have understood all of these symbols. And notice again, baskets, baked goods, and birds. These dreams have a series of 3. There also would be well understood. The symbols would be understood by the 2 that dreamed the dreams. And I think that's kind of a hint for us when we have a dream. There should be some recognition of the symbols in the dream. Birds, as I've mentioned many times, it's always a picture of demons in Scripture. And it couldn't help. I remember that movie, The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock. That movie just freaked me out. This seems to indicate this guy was guilty. And so maybe he tried to give Pharaoh the bird flu. All right, you're going to say to yourselves, Rick, you didn't actually go there, did you? Yep. And all I can say is don't fall for it again this time. And we'll leave it at that. For those who like to study, you might want to see what birds and vultures represent in Scripture. It's a great study. And you see them from Abraham in Genesis all the way to Babylon in the book of Revelations. Really an interesting study. I keep giving you guys things you can go study. 3 days is another one. That's a good one. Verse 18. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. So that's the same. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. And the baker probably said, well, thanks, Joey. Great for the great news. Right? Lift off your head. Lift off again. I've mentioned this before, is the word in Hebrew, NASA or NASA, NASA. We think of the Apollo spaceship lifting off. So when you think of lift off your head, think of a spaceship taking off. Your head's about to be removed off the launching pad. Off is not a good thing. It means he's going to be decapitated. Then he's going to be hung or impaled on a tree or a pole, and the birds are going to eat his flesh. Basically, he's going to be a bird feeder, right? Kind of like in your backyard. And so on the bright side, he's not going to have to watch this because his head's been taken off. So his dream was a nightmare. So I was going to name this The Nightmare on Pyramid Street, if you will, with a hat tip to Freddy Krueger on Elm Street. But this reminds me of Daniel 5. Remember, Daniel explains the writing on the wall to Belshazzar. Tonight, your life's going to be taken from you, right? No pulling of punches. He's speaking the truth in love. It's a hard truth. He knows this guy's not going to like what he's hearing, but he's telling him the truth. Joseph was faithful to deliver God's message to both of them. Deliverance to the cupbearer, judgment to the baker. Joseph faithfully delivered the message. So Joseph, like Jesus, both spoke the truth. A commentary by Boyce, it says, how many there are who are willing to preach the cupbearer's sermon, but are unwilling to preach the baker's sermon. It's a sad commentary on today's small C churches, right? Only speak smooth things. Just tell me the smooth things. Don't challenge me. Don't put me on a spot. Don't tell me things I need to do or what a sinner I am. I just want to hear the good stuff. Live my best life now. 5 steps to being whatever it is you want to be. So as a spiritual truth, many, if not most, the pastors today are happy to preach the feel-good gospel, and they never challenge the flock. And the Lord calls pastors to preach the whole counsel of God, from Genesis to Revelation. Don't sugarcoat it. Speak the truth in love, but speak the truth. In Isaiah 30, verse 10, it says, we the people, this is in the New King James Version, who the people say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things, speak to us smooth things, prophecy deceits. And you could read that maybe and kind of read through it and not really grasp the intent here. In the New Living Testament, it says they tell the seers, stop seeing visions. They tell the prophet, don't tell us what's right. Tell us nice or smooth things. Tell us lies. That's what this verse is saying to us. Just don't make us face our sinfulness. And if anybody is in one of those churches where everything is fine, you come in and you get two songs and a 30-minute, how to live the better life or how to be a better you, and you go home with a smile on your face week after week after week after week, you're never challenged. You need to find a new church because you're not being taught the full counsel of God. We all need to be challenged. So in a prophetic sense here, I think, prophetically speaking, think of this. The baker has 3 days to get things right with God, doesn't he? He's being warned now, 3 days from now, your head's going to be removed. So when I looked at this, the people are like the dreamers, kind of like the baker, right? God gives him a warning. It's like people today. Joseph is like a messenger. He's like the one who shares the truth with us. We're the people. Joseph, the messenger, the pastor, is the one who shares the truth with us. And death is the subject. Eternal damnation is what's on line. This is serious business. And the cupbearer, I don't know whether he heard from Joseph or not anything about God. I'm guessing he did over the course of time, but the fact that he forgot all about him would lead me to believe that he didn't leave a lasting impression with the guy. The baker is facing his head being cut off in 3 days. He might have been a lot more serious about hearing what Joseph had to say about the one true God. And in Hebrews 9:27, we're told it's appointed for men to die once, and after this, the judgment. So this is going to happen to him physically. It doesn't have to happen to him spiritually. He has a choice to make. We all have that same choice to make. Are we going to surrender to God, have our sins forgiven, spend eternity in heaven with God, or are we going to not make that choice, spend eternity in hell? It's bad enough to have your head cut off. It's even worse to get it put back on and spend it in the lake of fire for eternity. So you and I can be the messenger of eternal hope to others when they wonder what's going to happen to them when they die. In fact, you can ask other people if they're going to go to heaven when they die to open a conversation. Great conversation starter with people. If they say yes, ask them why. And if they give you any reason other than Jesus, right, then you need to explain the process to them. Your works won't get you there. I'm better than most people. That doesn't cut it. God doesn't grade on a curve. You either get 100 on every test or you fail. There are no other options. So explain the process to them. And we've been given a mission of reconciliation. Speak the truth in love, but the operative words are speak the truth. Don't remain silent. And read this verse. It will definitely get their undivided attention. In Revelations 20, verse 13 and 14, the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the Lamb's book of life was cast into the lake of fire. You can ask them, is your name written in the Lamb's book of life? If so, why? Why do you say that? I assure you, it'll get their attention. I've done it before. Right? We're all going to die physically. We don't have to die spiritually. So I'm pretty sure Joseph told him about the God of Abraham over those 3 days. We can tell people about Jesus. Fear God, not Pharaoh, not our government, not what people around you think, even if they're in your close family. We need to surrender our lives to the Lord and then share what he's done with us to other people. Now, in verse 20, it says, Now it came to pass on the third day, here we go again, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the cupbearer, and the chief bearer among them, his servants, he summoned them literally. Then he restored the cupbearer to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, as Joseph interpreted for him. So the birthday here, just remind, this was a holiday in those days. So Pharaoh's celebrating his birthday. According to the Rosetta Stone, the rules in that time was that the king, the Pharaoh, Pilate in the New Testament, were allowed to free one prisoner. And so we see that happening here. He frees the cupbearer, he hangs the other one. So I just wrote down this as a spiritual truth. The baker could have made this his spiritual birthday. He had 3 days to make that decision. It was Pharaoh's birthday. It could be his too, in a spiritual sense. And another foreshadowing here, I think this points to Pilate. Pilate had the opportunity to free a prisoner, if you remember, but he allowed the people to select Barabbas over Jesus. He knew Jesus was innocent. He said as much. I find no fault in this man. His wife said, Don't do anything to Jesus. I had a dream. You don't want to mess with this guy. Yet he let the majority rule. And usually the majority is wrong. You don't believe me? Go with the majority in the stock market and see what happens. They're almost always wrong. So it's lifted up means he summoned them. Hanged, remember Galatians 3:13, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So the dreams led to interpretations, led to their fulfillment. This is what will happen if God truly is the one that's given you the dream. You'll get the interpretation through him or through your own understanding of it or reading scriptures, and then it'll be fulfilled. And a great book on prophecy, if you're interested, Every Prophecy of the Bible by John Walvoord. It's Walvoord. It has every prophecy in the Bible laid out for you. So that's another great resource. Another study you might want to do, compare the birth pains in Matthew 24, because I was looking at these chapters, and compare it to the seal judgments in Revelation 6 and 7. Step by step by step, they match, one by one by one. Jesus told them exactly how it's going to happen in Matthew, and the seal judgments lays it out in Revelation. Now, here's a difference between Joseph and Jesus that I spotted. Joseph's message rescued the innocent one. Jesus's message saves the guilty as well. Now, in 23, yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So I wonder in the prison after the dream is interpreted, if he said, Sure, of course I'll remember you. I'll tell Pharaoh all about you. I'll remember, but he didn't bring it to mind. Out of sight, out of mind. I was thinking sometimes you meet somebody and, you say you pray for them, or you're watching somebody online, or maybe I like to follow Amir Sarfati on Telegram, and he'll say, could you pray for this or pray for that? And I pray for it for a day or two, and then I tend to forget it. Or Pastor Jack Hibbs has asked us to pray like a Tennessean. The governor of Tennessee asked all of the people in the state of Tennessee to pray that God would do a work in the state of Tennessee. And Pastor Jack asked us to be Tennesseans, to pray every single day, pray and fast, maybe a meal a day or something if you're able physically. And just pray along with the Tennesseans that God would do a work in this country. Now, the prophet Amos wrote in chapter 6, verse 6, they drink wine in bowls and they anoint themselves with the chief of ointments, but they're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. And I just found that interesting. It sounded so much like the cupbearer here. So Joseph is wronged again. He's going to spend 2 more years in prison. And it reminded me in Luke 23:42, we'd never finished that study, but I'd finished studying the book of Luke. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Right? The thief on his right side at the cross. So as a spiritual truth, Jesus will never forget those that have given their lives to him. But how often do we forget him as we go about our daily lives? And that's kind of the picture here. Joseph never forgot the cupbearer. Cupbearer forgot him. Jesus will never forget us. A lot of times we go through our day not even giving a second thought to the Lord. And it's a sad thing when you do a good thing for somebody and then they just go on and forget all about you. And I just wrote, we need to remember people who helped us along the way. They were there for us in tough times. Maybe employees who worked so hard for us and helped us get ahead. The neighbor that's always there to help you out. One good deed deserves another. And so at Matthew 10:8, Jesus said, freely you've received, freely give. It doesn't cost us anything to just help people along. It doesn't cost anything to pray for them, just a minute or two. So a life lesson here is if you want God to use you greatly, you can also expect for him to prepare you greatly. He can't do anything great in your life if he hasn't prepared you to do it. And so God here is still preparing Joseph for a much larger assignment, which we'll be reading in coming chapters. And I imagine Joseph saying, Lord, are we there yet? And the Lord said, no, Joseph, not yet. Wait for it. In Luke 16:10, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in little is also unjust in much. So here's a few Joseph to Jesus comparisons. Both of them found themselves between 2 prisoners. One died and one was saved. Interesting picture pointing forward. They'd both be raised up in 3 days. Joseph asked to be remembered by one prisoner. One prisoner asked to be remembered by Jesus. Joseph deals with 2 items, the cup or wine and the bread, as did Jesus at the Last Supper. And what was interesting to me in studying this, with looking at the words in the Hebrew, as the words for a white basket mean a wicker basket with holes or slits in it where it's woven together. And so it's interesting that the wicker basket has the holes. Think of matzah bread. It has stripes or these gaps between the wicker, and it has holes. And so it's kind of a picture of the matzah bread, which we take at communion. So we have the wine and the matzah bread. And we have the same picture here with a cupbearer and the bread baker. So here's another good study, bread and wine. All the way from Melchizedek with Abraham earlier in our study in Genesis, to the Last Supper, to communion in the New Testament, to the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven, supper of the Lamb in heaven with us. Bread and wine just keeps reappearing all the way through the Bible for us. And if we look at the characters, Joseph on the positive side, he cared for others. He was thoughtful. He trusted God, so he was a believer. He spoke truth even when it was difficult. He was courageous. He chose not to blame his brothers for his Egyptian captivity, said he was stolen, not sold. So he was forgiving. He'd already forgiven them. He wasn't above asking somebody else for help. So he was honest with other people. He had patience, which is a fruit of the Spirit, and he lived by faith and hope. Then, for nothing he did wrong, everything in his life was going wrong. He was in prison for years, and yet he served God with a grateful heart. For as long as this was going on and all the troubles he was having, he continued to have a smile on his face, continued to minister to other people. He imagined the heartbreak, or imagined the heartbreak when the cupbearer completely forgot about him. How easy it would have been to just throw up your hands and say, I'm done. I'm finished trusting God. But he didn't. Even though the guy didn't come to his rescue, give him the get out of jail free card immediately, he didn't walk away from the Lord. He just kept serving. And so if you feel like Joseph today, remember Joseph, trust God. He's working in the background and the outcome's going to be amazing. There's a reason for what we're going through. Sometimes it's of our own doing. We've done something and brought it on ourselves. But if we haven't, then it's one of those tests or trials. God's trying to build our character. Just ask him to help us go through it and to show us the way. Now, Potiphar, I think on the positive side, it seems to me he believed that Joseph was innocent and he gave him the best position he could in the prison. On the negative side, he didn't free Joseph, even though he thought he was innocent, probably of the fear of his wife or maybe any repercussions that it might bring about, the fear of his other slaves and other people. The cupbearer, on the negative side, he went on his merry way living the good life, and he didn't look back to think about and help Joseph. He does in a future chapter. But right now, he's just back living the high life. And then we have the baker. On the negative side, it would appear to me he was involved in something very evil, and he paid the consequences with the death penalty. But on the positive side, I don't know, just a hunch, but perhaps he turned to God because of Joseph. He had 3 days, and I hope he made good use of the 3 days he had left. And so if we look at this as a question, which of these two men do you think might have turned to God for forgiveness? I think we might meet the baker in heaven. I don't know if we'll see the cupbearer there. And then we see Pharaoh, and I just see this as positive. He seems to have done his due diligence. He got to the bottom of the matter and administered justice fairly. And imagine that, fair justice for all. Remember back when that used to be a thing? Well, as a foreshadow of future events, one, in Revelation, the birds are going to come and eat the carcasses of the evil, just as they did with the baker. So we see this pointing ahead to the future. And second, the two prisoners with Joseph might and probably do point to the two men that were hung on the sides of Jesus. So as I meditated on this passage as I was studying, I saw something else that stood out to me. Both of these guys were in a bad place in prison. And it's kind of like us living in this world. We're trapped in a sinful place. It also happens to be a prison in Egypt, which is a picture of sin. And yet Joseph kind of provides an outcome here. We see the cupbearer, that innocent one, right? He's in a bad place. He goes from bad to good. Notice the progression. There were buds on the vines. The buds turned into blossoms, and the blossoms brought forth clusters. His life went from bad to good. The baker who was found guilty, he goes from bad to worse. He's beheaded, impaled, and devoured. So you and I are living in a wicked place, but we have a choice. We can receive Jesus and be reprieved from eternity in hell, or we can ignore Jesus and end up in hell with the demons. Every person ever born either had or has a choice. And the key is they know that there's a choice available. A lot of people don't. And who's going to tell them? Who is it in our sphere of influence that doesn't know yet that they have a choice? And will we be a Jesus or Joseph to them? So as close this out, my final thoughts on this: ungrateful people will never fully understand God's greatest gift, Jesus, and they'll never rise to their full potential in this life. Second, Joseph had to undergo these difficult trials and tests in order to bring about God's plan of redemption for mankind. And we need to be thankful he did. God wasn't about to take him out of the oven before he was fully baked. So for us, let's not go off half-baked spiritually, right? People's lives are dependent on us. There's a Mannion Foundation, and their theme is, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? And I recalled that, hearing that recently on a Huckabee show. It just kind of fit here. And then finally, we may not have 3 days left, right? These guys both had 3 days. We don't know if we have 3 days. The Lord could return tonight or tomorrow or the next day. So if there is someone we need to talk to, we really better hurry and talk to them. We may be their last best chance. So Lord, please help us understand the urgency of these last days. Like Joseph, speak the truth in love to those who are lost, that they might receive a last moment reprieve or a pardon. And help us speak the truth in love and not be speakers of smooth words for fear of offending somebody. Just let us tell them the truth. We ask that in Jesus' name. And everybody says amen. Well, guys, I wanted to let you know, and whoever may listen to this on YouTube, I started posting some of these teachings on Twitter. I posted 5 of the chapters over the past 10 days, and they've had over 300 views. And if you guys are on social media, and any of these lessons we go through, if they impact you along the way, I just ask you, post them on your social media, maybe on Facebook or Twitter, Telegram, Instagram, whatever it happens to be, Gab. If you feel like you've gotten something out of it, post it, see what happens. You know, I might reach 1,200, 1,300 people on my social media platform after getting knocked off a couple of years ago by Twitter under @Jack at Twitter. I had about 7,000 followers at the time. So I haven't tried to build it up. I just keep getting people following me. In fact, most of them are women who have pictures who you don't want to look at. And so I get a notice that they're following me. I don't follow them back, but they're following me and they're seeing all these lessons in Genesis or Revelation. And so who knows, maybe some of them will get saved. So if you guys do the same, between you and I and anybody that watches this lesson, we could reach tens, hundreds of thousands of people. You might only reach 2 or 3 people. One of them could reach 10,000. And so if you have the time, you feel there's something worthwhile in the chapter, just encourage you, share it with other people. The worst they can do is unfriend you. Bottom line is, they're not your friend anyhow. You don't even know them. They don't know you. You don't know them. They're not your friend. Took me a while to learn that. When somebody would say something negative, I'd be all hurt because a friend did that to me. Then I realized I don't even know who this is. So anyway, we're going to leave the lesson with that tonight. And Lisa, if you want to shut it off, guys, we'll see you next week. Pray you have a great week. And we'll be back next week with lessons 41 and 40.